Alright everyone, for the first time in quite some time there's been a confirmed case of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now you'll remember a few years ago the outbreak was mainly hitting Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, and it killed many thousands of people. Technically speaking, because of burial habits and the fact the medical establishment that moved in there, because order began to break down, and the international community is like, well, we gotta do something or it's gonna spread further. They started cremating bodies, which is pretty standard when you're talking about something like Ebola. You know, if a person is bleeding from every pore and hemorrhaging everywhere and all fucked up before they die, the whole body is basically a giant diseased bag of infection. You know, anti-alarmism aside from the Western medical community, oh, don't worry, it's not that easily transmissible. Just ignore all these thousands of people that are fucking keeling over during the course of this month all over the place. The standard protocol is cremation. And what you know about these particular cultures is they consider having a physical burial extremely important. The body is washed by hand, which is in some cases how it's spread. And the idea of cremation is almost like a form of blasphemy in some cultures, because they think there's no actual site for them to visit to show, yes, you know, I miss this person that's gone on to, you know, the paradise or whatever. So a lot of people, they'd be infected, and the family wouldn't tell them. They'd bury them anyway. They'd do the best that they could, and this helped to spread the infection around. I guess the worry when this happens in Africa is usually that something like that will happen, that the Western medical community will largely be unheeded outside of urban zones, and so it's like a slow burn of the disease in the more rural areas where people have these more tribal beliefs. You know, if you're talking the inner city of one of these nations in West Africa, what's it called, Libreville or something, Libreville, or one of these larger settlements, yeah, people probably have more of an education about the idea of contamination, about the idea of epidemics, as opposed to some village out in the middle of nowhere, which sometimes Ebola goes through and wipes everyone out. And the Congo is actually sort of the center of Ebola-dom. Many of the larger outbreaks that have happened have been from the same region that just had its first confirmed case there. There were others that died, and I think they were testing them. And it was probably Ebola, let's face it. And it could spread further. Yeah, you could end up with a few dozen people dying, or it could be a few thousand. Or it could mutate and go fully airborne, and it could wipe out 1 million people. And these people within the medical community that tried to pretend that there was no problem with Ebola apparently were hoping that the general public wouldn't understand the concept of mutation. Now, as Ebola is given over to mutation as like influenza? Apparently not. But it did mutate during this last outbreak. There were silent Ebola cases where the virus, it stayed infectious and infected people, but it didn't actually give them any symptoms. Like there was something mutated about it, so it could keep infecting people, and then occasionally you'd get like a reversion or something, and another case would crop up, and they finally sort of tamped it down. It looks like the Ebola epidemic is done in that part of Africa. Now, though, there's another outbreak in Central Africa, and the situation is really, let's face it, no better than it was before. The world is still largely unprepared to deal with Ebola. If it were to become more infectious, that one random mutation that makes it, you know, maybe 2 or 3 times as prone to jumping person to person as before, would wipe out a lot of people. And a lot of times what you get, the way that Ebola enters the human culture, is through the eating of bushmeat. You know, some infected animal, I believe it's mainly bats or like chimpanzees are the main carriers, but the former more than the latter. And people consider that to be a delicacy in the Congo and some of these areas. And so once in a while somebody gets Ebola. And so you've got some sort of communal meal-eating village out in the middle of nowhere with no real significant medical contact with any Western nation, or even with their own, you know, maybe the more developed medical infrastructure, even to third world standards. And someone gets Ebola in the community. By the time that they're keeling over, everybody else has been exposed to Ebola too. I think there was an outbreak in the 70s in the Congo. if I remember, back when I was researching about it during the last Ebola scare. I think it was 1978, if I remember correctly. I think several thousand people died at the time in one of these regions that was hit. And there was an Ebola outbreak, by the way. And people didn't even talk about this. There was a smaller Ebola outbreak, one that was more easily contained, but it did happen, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, while everyone was fixated on, like, Liberia and Sierra Leone, for the most part. There was actually a subsequent outbreak at the same time of a slightly distinct variant of Ebola within the Congo. So this area, it has these exotic diseases. Sometimes they go pandemic mode. And the Western world really needs to be prepared in such a situation, and we're not. We're totally unprepared. If a virus, it doesn't have to be Ebola, it could be a strain of the flu, like Spanish flu style epidemic or anything like that. It could be 5%, fatality rate, it could be 99%, fatality rate. But regardless, we don't really have any significant protocols in place to stop a fast-moving virus or other infectious agent from spreading into our own countries. Especially in Europe. I mean, Europe has porous borders at this point, so if if Africa gets infected with something, it can go to Europe very easily. As long as it can make its way to Tunisia, Algeria, or Libya, it would be very, very easy for it to enter Europe. There's not a whole lot that they can do. They don't even, I mean, apparently in Europe it's illegal to even close your borders for the most part, let alone actually turn people away when they get there. It's like in Southeast Europe there with the migrant crisis. Some of these countries, they put up fencing, they had guards there, and people start storming in, they just sort of step back. It's sort of like a show of force. They're hoping that the people will just go away, and when they don't, they say, okay, okay, you can come on in, just go through the country, just don't settle here. I think that was Macedonia the last time it happened, or was it Bulgaria or one of these nations? And it was all very surreal, because there were like 20, 30,000 migrants there, charging at the border. They're just sitting there in like a makeshift camp, and they're hammering away at the fences. And then you've got the riot police just standing there like, we don't know what to do. We haven't even been told what to do. We're getting one story from the government, another story from the local government, another story from the EU. Merkel's saying one thing, and like Nigel Farage is saying another. I don't even know how to proceed in this situation. They just sort of stand down. And then here in the United States, of course, in the last Ebola outbreak, we took the strange measure of actually bringing back several infected individuals to the United States. Now, yeah, it was contained, it didn't spread, but can you remember the panic that happened? I think it was Houston, wasn't it? Or was it Austin? One of the people was brought there. And, actually it was Dallas, I remember now. And everyone was like, there were people that didn't want to go outside. There were people that were like stocking up for zombie apocalypse or something like that. It was nuts. And it was for several days, it like locked a lot of things down in the area around the hospital where this person was, because people didn't even really know how Ebola functions. So it was pretty funny. It's not maybe funny when someone is shitting blood and puking blood and sweating blood and coughing blood at the same time. But these diseases do exist, and the response of the medical establishment here, and this is, I think, what gets people worried, because they can't have confidence in a system that says this, is, don't worry, it can't actually spread that easily. It has to be physical contact. No, you can't get Ebola from someone like coughing blood all over you. It's like, that's patently false. The World Health Organization's own outline on Ebola prevention wasn't even real. Some of these doctors didn't even have full body suits. They had just the regular mask and the kind of hazmat suit that you would use for, I don't know, processing vinegar or something like that. It's like, that's not exactly going to give a person full protection. They can still be exposed to that virus. Yes, it's going to cut down on that rate. Yeah, it's going to make them safer. A lot of the people, the native medical establishment, the real problem was a lot of the doctors and nurses fled the battlefield as soon as the epidemic got bad in West Africa the last time, because they're like, oh, fuck this, I'm not dealing with it. I'm watching 10, 20 people die of this horrendous disease. They're asking me to sponge them down and, funnel feed them and do all this other stuff. I'm just not willing to do that. I'm not being paid enough. It's different. You get some Western doctor gets $250,000 a year and gets all sorts of accolades and stuff for going to an Ebola zone, yeah, they might be willing to take the risk for a bonus. But you've got some African doctor that makes, like, in some of these countries, doctors, surprisingly, their income's not that much higher than the general population. So they're still on bushmeat budget, and they're being asked to risk their lives on a near constant basis and work like 18 hours a day while doing so. Yeah, you think they're going to have a problem with that. The medical establishment of Liberia completely collapsed. Their hospitals were closed. The only operative medical infrastructure that even existed in that particular country during the last outbreak was foreign in nature. This is, by the way, partially a problem of Western foreign aid. We give so much medical aid and so forth. We supply, doctors go to Africa all the time, to places where there's an outbreak. We give them supplies, we give them all these things. So there's no native medical industry that's ever cropped up in these countries. We've actually done them a disservice. On the one hand, we give free food to people in Africa. Anytime, at the drop of a hat, we give them free grain constantly. So the farmers can't compete, famine breaks out. We supply all sorts of medical crap and doctors and say, don't worry, we'll foot the bill. And so their native medical establishment doesn't thrive. They're not building the new hospital. They're not trying to buy the new equipment. They're not trying to expand the medical training of their country, hire more doctors or pay them more so they don't, like, again, flee the battlefield the next time Ebola breaks out. And the Democratic Republic of the Congo, on a Human Development Index, is, yeah, pretty low down there. Most of the nation is nothing more than a bunch of jungle with some dirt roads and some villages which would not even approximate commie block like ghetto shanty towns in Venezuela. That would be a pretty bad place to have an outbreak. The worst thing would be it hits an urban center really hard, a place with high population density, and the next person who gets sick is like a cook or working in a maternity ward or something like that and doesn't report their symptoms because they're too scared. That'd be probably pretty bad. And that's the sort of nightmare scenario you can look forward to eventually happening. In the long span of time, that sort of shit hits the fan, Murphy's Law stuff is inevitable. That should get the Western countries worried, because here we don't really have native Ebola and some of these other viruses. Shouldn't we attempt to scale back our intervention and instead fund the native growth of the medical infrastructure there in hopes that we don't have to deal with such a situation down the road? So yeah, there's been an Ebola case again. Not a surprise. I mean, it's native there anyway. Somebody probably ate. They ate a chimpanzee. They ate a bat. They ate some other animal that can carry Ebola. And they got screwed up, and now they're dead. That's about all. Peace out.